Welcome in, everyone, to Be on the Beat with 32 Beat Writers. My name is Zach Hyduk, and today I have with me Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer. Mike is a beat reporter, as I mentioned, for the Charlotte Observer, covering the Carolina Panthers. You can also be heard on Processing Blue, a Panthers podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're looking for him on X or Twitter, you can find him at Mike_E_K. That's Kaye. You can see it there on his name description. Mike, welcome into the show, sir.
Zach, you have nailed the worst handle on X just perfectly. Everybody stumbles over it, but you just did it. You went with it. You're a true pro.
I was practicing it all the way this morning from dropping my kid off at my in-laws, so I'm glad I got it right.
Well, it's good to have that practice. It really is. It's training camp for everybody, as they say.
There you go. Yeah. Speaking of training camp, it was interesting. So yesterday we were talking just a little bit before we started recording here, first padded practice for the Panthers, and it was a little bit interesting. I don't want to talk about this too long, but we also got some news yesterday of certain wide receivers signing a contract. So that was interesting. DJ Moore signing in Chicago. We've got a lot of, and his replacements are kind of currently still in Carolina there. So I'm interested to see how that's going. And I don't know. Are there any rumblings or thoughts around DJ Moore signing that extension up there in Chicagoland?
I was expecting to get some text messages. I didn't. And frankly, at that point, I was so just the sun had beaten me down from the day, and I just watched baseball and kind of crawled into a ball and kind of avoided everything. But what I would say is this. I think DJ, his numbers have been steady throughout his career, but I think you truly saw him emerge as a true number one last year. I think there were folks in the organization who thought, he was probably best fit as a 2A, right? Like wide receiver. Like when you really look at the spectrum of the NFL, there's about 10 elite wide receivers, right? And then everybody else, there's a massive drop off. And then there's some pseudo de facto ones. And there's mostly a lot of number two, in theory, wide receivers. He was just incredible last year. I think his ability to play with subpar quarterback talent and raise their performance is pretty incredible. In hindsight, I think they much rather would have made Brian Burns part of the trade up to number one than, DJ Moore, because I think losing DJ Moore set them back so far offensively. And listen, I'll take my lumps there. I believe pass rush is more important than wide receiver on a general plane. And I thought, it was logical to, if you were going to include a player, to go with the wide receiver over the pass rusher, especially with the way the market is. But that was kind of contingent on them getting an extension done with Julius Peppers not Julius Peppers, Brian Burns, sorry, Hall of Fame on my brain. Excuse me. And I was literally just reading an article that my colleague wrote on Julius Peppers, so it's on the brain. But I think that was contingent on Brian Burns getting an extension to justify that. And it never happened. And it just snowballed from there. And a bunch of people lost their jobs. And now Brian Burns is in New York, actually New Jersey. There it is.
Yeah. You're kind of setting me up here. The Panthers last year, it was bad, and I'm one of the people that took the cheese last year a bit. I had Bryce Young down as rookie of the year. I thought that they would push possibly for the division, which, in fairness, I feel like I was right about some of the competition in the division. So I'm going to give myself half credit on that. We don't want to dive too deep into last season, but, you mentioned the head coach, Frank Reich, not making it through the season. There was some stuff with the owner and some fans at some games that, was made the news. Bryce Young really struggled, whether it was his fault or not. And this year they brought in head coach Dave Canales, some people to believe to be a quarterback whisperer. He's got experience with Geno Smith in Seattle a couple years back, Baker Mayfield in Tampa. This last year. But something that's different with them versus Bryce Young is they had a lot more experience coming into Canales, working with them. So I'm curious, what do you feel like Canales brings to the table in general when it comes to this offense, and how is this guy going to help solve the Panthers' woes?
Well, I think he's a very good communicator. He brings a lot of energy. I think there's a lot of buy-in because of his relatability. Remember, he's in his early 40s, and while there are quite a few players that are in their early 20s, there are also a lot of guys who are in their 30s and on the back half of their career. And I think when you see buy-in from those players, it trickles down. Now, offensively, Canales is kind of like, he's the quarterback's coach, the offensive coordinator, the head coach, the guidance counselor. I think he might make French fries as well. Like, he does everything. There's that old commercial. It cuts, it chops, it dies. Like, he literally, he's got his hand in basically everything. He is very heavily involved, and I think that can be good. I think it can be bad. We've seen a lot of head coaches, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Kevin O'Connell, have a lot of success in that model. But we also have to remember that Dave Canales was an offensive coordinator for the first time last year. The offense wasn't particularly great in Tampa. And I think he's going to have a lot of runway based on how everything went with Frank Reich and that group. He has a GM that he's very familiar with in Dan Morgan. They have a relationship from where they were in Seattle. But Dave is really taking on this Bryce Young project. And, for those who don't know, Dave's a former quarterbacks coach, a former wide receivers coach, and a former pass game coordinator. We've seen the wide receivers benefit from his expertise, along with Brad Isaac, the offensive coordinator. He's a former wide receivers coach. Rob Moore, their wide receivers coach, is a former Pro Bowler. So there's a lot of investment in the passing game. And I think you'll see, as much as he's talked about wanting to be stubborn with the run, they're giving Bryce Young cheat codes. Because when you look at Baker Mayfield last year, he was able to find guys particularly easier than he was in previous offenses. There was kind of like a paint by numbers-esque, read. And so I think what we're seeing right now is, I think they want to get the ball out quickly with Bryce Young. The protection is seemingly improved with the additions of Damian Lewis at left guard and Robert Hunt at right guard. Deontay Johnson is getting open regularly. He's probably the best route runner that the Bryce Young's worked with since Devontae Smith. And I think, for them, this is an opportunity to really kind of explore the avenues of the passing game.
Yeah. And let's talk I have one kind of more general question, then we can dig into the players more specifically that you mentioned as well. I had a question I put out on Twitter. If anybody had any specific questions, and Kyle Borgognoni of the Fantasy Footballers, actually, thanks for commenting, asked a question about pre-snap motion. Again, I know that we're only kind of just getting into real padded practices here, but have you noticed any more pre-snap motion or motion at the snap? That's really big. We see successful offenses use that pretty frequently, but last year Tampa Bay wasn't super high in that. Do you envision that being part of the offense, or how is the offense going to look if it's not that?
So we are not allowed to talk about specifics from practice as far as that's concerned. But what I would say is, think about Tampa last year. Right?
Okay.
That would be the way I would. His offense is his offense. And so I think, a concern is this going to be too by the numbers, right? Is this in baseball hitting for average? And I think that that's a relatively fair concern. They will use guys in motion. I do think that that'll happen. It's not something that I think is going to be a major focus of the offense.
Okay. All right. Well, if I press you too hard about something, feel free to tell me you just can't. So I appreciate you doing what you can for us. They're obviously, they've got Bryce Young, selecting them 1 overall, and they're going to be riding with him for the foreseeable future. last year, his fault or not, that was just not great. And, hopefully they can put a better environment around him this year. Do you think that Bryce Young, though, in whatever projection that you can make, is the guy, or is he capable of kind of helping lead them out of this situation that they find themselves in?
So I think it's hard to crown a guy the guy when you have the season that he had, right? And we've got, we're 5 practices into training camp. But I do think he's capable of leading them to some sort of success. I don't know if he's ever going to warrant the number 1 overall pick pedigree, but I do think there is talent there. He has made some incredibly impressive throws over the last 2 days. Remember, it's 2 days of practice. You don't want to get too high. You don't want to get too low. He's coming off a season where he had 11 touchdowns and 10 interceptions and wasn't particularly great in the pocket. Listen, I thought he was the most dynamic quarterback as far as off-schedule throws in the draft last year, and that all kind of went away. He didn't really throw deep. They didn't really test him. He was sacked 62 times for 477 yards, which is crazy when you think about that Jonathan Mingo started 14 games and had 418 scoreless yards, right? Like that's the stat I always go back to, is like he lost more sack yardage than his 2nd round pick wide receiver, who was a full-time starter, got in yardage. Like that's wild. I think last year the ecosystem around him was not good. I do think a lot of people got kind of sick of it's everybody else's fault sort of thing, but I think there is reality to that. I think Bryce had his quirks for sure. There's no question about it. Especially in the pocket, it did kind of seem like it was one read and then there was confusion. He does look very confident in this offense so far. He's making very, very accurate throws, and he's testing it a little bit downfield. Like there have been some highlight moments so just to give you, I know you don't want to focus a lot on last year, but when he came into rookie camp, he was making throw after throw. I call him Bama Bryce when he does like off script stuff. Like he was really turning into that alter ego. And then for some reason during the off-season program, the off-scheduled stuff and the deep throws kind of went away. And then training camp, he barely threw over 15 yards. And then I was like, well, maybe they're trying to, get him to be better in his intermediate accuracy, which if there was one critique of him as a prospect from a passing standpoint, I kind of thought his intermediate accuracy wasn't as good as his deep ball accuracy. And then we got to the preseason and it was like, this is what this guy is doing this year. Like, I mean, I've said this before, but like every week of training camp practice last year, I took a win off their tally for my prediction. Like you could kind of see it coming. And I remember there was the preseason game against the Giants that was like very telling. And I think I initially had them going 8-9 when I turned in my preview for the year. And I did it a couple of weeks early. And I was considered one of the pessimists of the bunch. So, I mean, even then, but I think what Bryce has right now is an ecosystem that works. They've upgraded DJ Chark with Deontay Johnson, who is a significantly better route runner and has looked great. Adam Thielen not being your number 1 target is pretty beneficial to you, especially because he has such control over the slot. Jonathan Mingo's a year in the NFL. He knows what to expect. He's been phenomenal, frankly, the first 5 practices. Terrace Marshall, who has just been passed over by every coaching staff imaginable. Like I've been here for 2 years or, not even 2 full seasons. And I've covered, what is it? This is my 5th head coach, if you count interims. And he's been passed over by basically all of them except for Steve Wilkes. He's looked great. I think I think this passing game is starting to click, and I think that's largely due to Bryce Young.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And I think, we'll stick on the wide receivers because you brought them up. And that's been one of the bigger surprises for me in training camp is hearing the words Jonathan Mingo and impressive together. I'm like, what, like, I don't even know how to process that information, after everything that kind of happened last year. So let's stick with them. They, as you mentioned, they brought in Deontay Johnson from the Steelers, drafted Xavier Legette at the end of the first round of the draft this year. We know that Johnson has talent, kind of on a 1-year prove it deal, I believe, though, coming in from Pittsburgh. And Legette, while he's, athletic, he's got some kind of red flags with a very late breakout age. If you, categorize and track those things, didn't really do much until his 5th season in college. So that, I'm not saying he can't do anything, but it's just something to note. Are these guys the solution to the pass game that Carolina hopes they are?
I mean, I think that remains to be seen. Like, here's the thing. Terrace Marshall has like a breakout every summer, and then they put the pads on, he disappears, right? Like, Jonathan Mingo is a guy who I think his ceiling is Anquan Bolden, but I think his floor is like Jordan Matthews, but like not Jordan Matthews in 2014, like Jordan Matthews in like 2017, right? Like, so I think that's kind of the thing they have to figure out. He's gotten off to a great start. He got off to a great start last year in a lot of ways. We have to see kind of what he does when he gets to games, because there are guys, I covered the Jaguars several years ago, and there are guys who are just practice players, and there are guys who are just gamers. And so you kind of have to see them in their natural environment, I guess. I think Terrace Marshall, in theory, if he continues to play well and Mingo continues to play well and Xavier Legette kind of gets off his kind of slow start, because it has been a slow start for the first round pick, which I kind of expected, just because he is he's a power upright runner. And I think when you don't have pads, it creates kind of like a, hey, I don't want to run over my teammate sort of hesitation. I've seen that a lot from guys. And you also kind of feel awkward in your body when you're in traffic. It seems, just based on my experience. Because I've seen AJ Brown kind of like take it easy in practice when he is not in pads. And so I think that's not easy, like not like lazy, but like, hey, I'm not going to go full tilt. And so I think Legette's kind of going to be kind of an outlier, right? Like Bryce Young's an outlier in a lot of ways as well. So this team isn't afraid to take chances. I do think Dan Morgan is set up for a better evaluation process. I think their draft class is, on paper, is a lot more nuanced and strategic than last year's was. And I think, look, a lot of guys failed last year in that draft class, including Jonathan Mingo. And I think he's got a chip on his shoulder, and I think he wants to perform really well. Steve Smith is working with him, because I don't know if you know this, but Steve Smith was one of the guys that recommended Mingo to the front office. So they want to see this through. I also think most of his success came in the slot in college. And when you have Adam Thielen, you're not playing in the another wide receiver's not getting in that slot, but they want to move guys around. They truly do. And I think, there's a clip that I posted yesterday where Adam Thielen was working a route from the outside. I think you'll see that a little bit more this season. I made a joke when they brought in Deontay Johnson and then drafted Xavier Legette. Wow, Adam Thielen's not going to have to run stop routes, 4 or 5 yards down the field every single time. Like he was running stick routes for like 7 yards of depth and just stopping and getting a catch for 6 or 7 yards. And that was it. I think Legette, Mingo, Johnson and Thielen all complement each other really well. And I think that shows some strategy. I mean, they have different pieces there. They brought in Devin Tompkins. We'll see how he does. Jalen Coker obviously has a very big draft Twitter following. He hasn't really done a lot. He had a nice catch in one-on-ones that I posted, but like, I think there's a lot of hype there. And Amir Smith-Marsette's a returner who is also playing very well. It's going to be tough to make this wide receiver group. And if they keep 6, I don't know if Coker makes it. Maybe they look for a trade partner for Terrace Marshall, but he asked for a trade last year and they found little to no takers. So,
yeah. Yeah, that's all good information. So it sounds like you're expecting Thielen, Johnson, Leggett, of course, all to make the roster, and then after that, Mingo, and it's just kind of up in the air after those 4 guys.
Basically, yeah. I mean, I think those are the 4 guys. Like Leggett and Mingo are competing for that third job, and that third job is going to be important. Canales has said that he doesn't believe in the traditional, X, Y, Z, wide receiver titles. They want to move guys around, even though Leggett does seem like a prototypical X from a size standpoint, but from like a skill set standpoint, he's probably better as a Z. Mingo played Z basically all last year, and I do not think that fit his skill set for the most part. But I mean, look, I think they're trying to figure out this wide receiver group. They've got a lot of wide receiver minds on that staff, and if there is an area for improvement, I do think wide receiver is a spot that's easy to kind of pick.
All right, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. Another thing we'll have to keep an eye on is the running back room. Got a lot of questions when we put it out on Twitter about Jonathan Brooks and when he's going to come back. I'm sure that the team has been spotty on when they expect him back. I know that the quotes have been like, we're just going to get him ready and he'll be here when he's here type of thing. But he's on the NFI currently with that ACL injury that he suffered in college. Miles Sanders, kind of as bright as he sometimes burned with the Eagles, seemed to dim quite a bit last year. We also, have Chuba Hubbard in the backfield, who's done not too bad at times. And we had a retirement of Rashad Penny that you announced the other day. So that backfield, until Brooks is back, what's it going to look like? And if you had to guess, which is a completely unfair question, but if you had to guess, when do you think Brooks gets work back in?
So I'll start with the first question. So Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard are competing. They're both entering make or break years for different reasons. Chuba Hubbard is coming off a breakout campaign last year. He's really impressed a lot of people with his work ethic. The guy spends 30 to 40 minutes after practice working on the jugs machine. He's what I like to call possession running back, in that he does not really lose yards, but he'll pick you up consistent 3 to 4 yards per carry. And I think they really view him as the favorite in the clubhouse to be the starter initially. Also, he's in a contract year, so he has every reason to play well. And you can kind of run him into the ground. We've seen that with teams where guys are in their contract year. If a guy's capable, they'll overload him with carries early, and hopefully that works out and everybody benefits. Miles Sanders has a chip on his shoulder. He kind of yelled stuff to the sideline yesterday after a pretty brutal 4-yard run. And brutal, I mean, like the pads were popping everywhere. And look, you like to see that from a running back who is coming off a pretty putrid season. I've covered Miles since the start of his career. I was in Philly for 4 years. I covered him as a rookie, his second year as well. And then he came here in parts of his third year as well. He's always had a thing with vision. Like, it's just, he's not really great in crowded space, but man, he's got a lot of athletic traits. He's been catching the ball pretty well in camp. I think he's been running a lot harder this year up the middle. You can spring him outside. I think you'll see him as more of a change of pace third down running back. I do think he's a better blocker than Chuba. So I think they complement each other pretty well. In regards to Jonathan Brooks, I think they're going to take it slow just because they have those 2 guys that they can kind of anchor the first half around. Like, they're not, guys who are replacement level. They've been starting running backs in the league. Hubbard is a guy who's become a leader in the locker room because of his work ethic. And I think Brooks will eventually overtake Sanders. And the thing is like, a lot of people have talked about Sanders being a trade candidate or being a release candidate. He's guaranteed his full contract. He's getting paid whether he's on the team or not. And I think it behooves the Panthers to see what he's got. It's not like he's just, completely cooked, right? Like, he is a guy who has talent. And to see what this new staff can do with him, I think that's the right call. Raheem Blackshear, if you want another name, is another guy to look out for. He had a pass swing pass thrown to him yesterday in the flat, and he ran like basically like 30, 35 yards to the end zone untouched, and it was padded practice. He's a guy that they really like on special teams. He can kick return. He's been around for a couple of years, and I think they'll keep 4 at least. Penny retiring wasn't particularly surprising. There was a reason why I interviewed him last week, because I wanted to get his perspective. And that kind of trended a little bit, with the other, the aggregation sites. But I think Penny, I never had Penny making the roster. He was not on my initial 53 projection heading into camp. He was really there to take on Brooks's reps when Brooks wasn't there. And so I think you've got a clearer picture now in the running back room. Mike Boone has impressed some folks. I don't know if he is really rosterable, but he's been around the league for a while, plays special teams well. We'll see how that kind of turns out. But for the most part, if you're really focused on fantasy, Chuba Hubbard would probably be your guy of the group.
So they'll bring him in slow then. Is week 4 or week 6 closer to a fair projection? Again, an unfair question to ask, but if I had to put you in the situation.
I think they'd like to get him up before cuts if they could.
Okay.
I think it's a matter of what they see in the preseason from the other guys. Like there is no panic. There's no rush to have him back. Remember, he's the future of this backfield. And so you don't want to deter the final 3 years of his contract with his rookie year, where you're not expected to contend. You're not expected to be this like elite offense. And so I think they bring him around slowly. Also, I think, in reality, they're having Leggett try to earn the starting job. I think there would be like a time where Brooks would be kind of, peppered in. I don't necessarily know that he would, the second he's off there, he's pulling a Todd Gurley and leading the charge. I think a lot of folks have kind of jumped to that conclusion. Just all the context clues tell me that this is going to be a healthy onboarding. And I think, listen, Brooks is a home run threat that Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard aren't. And it wouldn't shock me if in the second half of the season, Jonathan Brooks is the guy. But I think, at least to start, it's going to be the Chuba Miles tandem to go.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. And it is probably a good thing for the future of the Panthers and for Brooks personally that they do that, although I'm sure he's itching to get going. So we'll have to continue to monitor that as we go through. I know I've got you up against time here a little bit. So just very quickly on the tight end situation, they drafted Jatavion Sanders round 4. You've got Ian Thomas and Tommy Tremble there as well. Kind of just speak to us a little bit about that somewhat muddled tight end room, it feels like.
I think muddled is actually a really good word for it. So kudos to you. So Tommy Tremble's dealing with a hamstring injury. He was kind of the de facto starter coming into training camp as a trash truck comes by and distracts me like a bumblebee. But, they're letting Ian Thomas start. They want to run the ball a lot. So in 11 personnel, you will see Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas used pretty heavily just because they are plus blockers. I think they want Tremble to win the job. He's in a contract year, much like Chuba Hubbard. Also, much like Chuba Hubbard, he's really impressed a lot of people with his work ethic. He's also there with Chuba Hubbard 40 minutes after practice doing the jugs machine. I don't expect a huge output from the tight end position. I mean, if you watched Tampa last year and you watched the Panthers last year, you kind of know the room's basically the same. And I think they're going to flow through their running backs and wide receivers. That said, Tommy Tremble's been a pretty good red zone target throughout his career, and I think that's where he can really shine. Ian Thomas is actually having a very good camp as a pass catcher. You don't really associate pass catching with Ian Thomas's game. He's more of like the sixth offensive lineman most of the time. And I think, look, Jatavion Sanders is going to take a while. I think he is more likely to be the heir apparent to Adam Thielen in the slot down the road than Tommy Tremble at tight end, if that makes sense. Like, to me, Jatavion Sanders is a big slot. Like, you remember when that was all in vogue in the mid 2010s? Yeah. Like, that's what he is. He is not a blocker. He is not a guy that you're going to fool the defense with his versatility yet. He's really got to learn technique. He knows that. I think he's really impressive as an athlete. It's been kind of a slow onboarding process. He had a really great catch in individual drills where he like kind of reached up and skied for the ball over a linebacker in individuals, but otherwise he's been kind of quiet, which I definitely expected. And I think, that's going to be a process where, like, look, I get it. It's very easy to look at his traits and be like, you got to get him on the field, but he's going to take a bit. And I think when you want to run the ball as much as Dave Canales has said and improve the run in his offense, I think it's going to be a bit before Sanders gets on the field. Stephen Sullivan has looked pretty good, had a really nice touchdown catch yesterday. And he also has a background with Canales from Seattle, as well as the tight ends coach. And then Jordan Matthews has been kind of one of the stories of camp because of his work ethic. He is showing up 30 minutes before camp, and then he's leaving like 20 minutes after. He's gotten pretty good reviews on special teams. And, he used to be a wide receiver. Now he's a tight end. He's made some plays in team drills. So it'll be interesting to see how they use him. Maybe he's just a practice squad player that they kind of bring back and forth. But I think the tight end room is kind of like a work in progress, but not a very high upside, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's all good information. And I like that, little nugget about Jatavion Sanders potentially eventually replacing Adam Thielen in that role, but just, has a good ways to go. So last question before I let you go here.
Sure.
As we get through training camp, is there any one important thing that you think is the biggest thing to watch? Or is there one thing that you would just ask everybody to remember as we're working through that?
Well, not to be a negative guy here, but the pass rush, this pass rush group is not good. Jadeveon Clowney has been terrific. Honestly, he really has. He's been a leader. He's been very good. But outside of that, the room is leaving a lot to be desired. DJ Wadham, the guy they brought in to be kind of like the number 2 pass rusher, he's dealing with a quad injury. He's on PUP. Amari Barno, who they love on special teams, he's on PUP. They've got DJ Johnson, who's really just like a run stopper. He has no pass rush to him. Cam Gill, who they brought in, who's more of a special teamer. Caleb on Chason, who, if you've followed the draft for years, has not been a standout pass rusher, to say the least. It's just not great. And look, Ejiro Evero believes in stopping the run first and setting the edge. Like, that's his thing. That's not like lip service. But, while Clowney is an elite run defender, I don't know that you're going to see the Baltimore 9.5 sack production here because there's not as much talent around as there is in Baltimore. Everybody was having career years in Baltimore. So I'm curious to see what they do. They've had Yannick Ngakoue around. My understanding is that's not like a done deal yet. He's still out there. It's still a possibility, but he's not really a great fit for the system because, as I said, run stopping is a really important thing. Ejiro Evero, I would imagine he'd be more of like a rotational pass rusher, a third down specialist. But they got to do something. They do have number 1 priority on the waiver wire. They are going to look around. But also remember, they have less than $6 million in salary cap space, and they don't want to impact next year with void years because next year is the year where they feel like they can start to contend and spend a lot of money and bring in a lot of assets. So I would say if you're not hearing much about the pass rush, that's fine. I also think secondary, Austin Corbett moving to center, he's done a really nice job so far. And then they've got Lewis and Hunt, who I've mentioned before, and those guys are upgrades at guard. I think they've got pretty good offensive line depth, which is good because last year they basically had 15 different starters at the 2 guard spots. Mm-hmm. So I think they feel a lot better there. Ike Ikwanu's had a pretty good camp so far. We'll see if that continues as the pads and physicality kind of continue.
Okay. Yeah. And if that defense doesn't round into shape, maybe an interesting ride for the offense there, trying to keep up with maybe the other side as we go through this season. Thanks again. I really appreciate you joining, Mike. Guys, if you're not, please make sure to follow Mike over on X. He's been excellent through this training camp so far, so we highly recommend him. Before I let you go, where else can we find you, Mike?
Well, you can find me on Twitter with the worst, handle ever. You can, or X, excuse me.
Yeah, X though. Yeah, always forget.
Yeah, I got to get with it. I've had that handle since before I became a writer and everything, and I just stuck with it because you got to commit to the bit. You know what I mean? And then Processing Blue, we just put out a new episode this morning. Talked to Panthers legend Mike Rucker about Julius Peppers and Bryce Young and all those guys. And make sure you go to charlotteobserver.com. We run specials for first-time signups. You can get all your training camp information, plus, detailed analysis. I don't think there are very few outlets that cover training camp the way we do, for better or worse. And I think you can get a lot of information. I'm very heavy on the analysis. We do mailbags. We do a lot of fan interaction as well. We're also hosting an event with Mike Rucker in Charlotte. If you're interested, come check that out on my Twitter next week. And so that's where you can find me.
Sounds good. Well, we certainly appreciate everything that you do, Mike. Thanks again for joining us. Again, everybody, make sure to check him out. He's been doing an awesome job over there in I guess Charlotte and wherever the heck else the Panthers play. I can't think this morning. So thank you for joining us. Make sure to check out our website at 32beatwriters.com as well, where we have player training camp news and summaries, player tracking tools, and more. Make sure to keep up there for all the most recent and relevant information. For Mike, Kaye, I'm Zach Heidu. We will see you later.